better late than never. And given that this book has just come out at the very end of 2020, perhaps it is appropriate that we start just a little late. Welcome to the launch of a new book by Centre for London and Professor Tony Travers at the LSE. London's Mayor at 20, Governing a Global City in the 21st Century. I will brandish the book here so you know it is a real physical thing, even in this digital age. My name's Jack Brown. I'm a research manager at Centre for London. And I'm one of 3 editors involved in this book and 21 authors, I think, if you include Tony Blair, who provided the foreword because his government was responsible for the creation of the mayor. So this was very much a work of collaboration, which is something that I'm delighted about personally. I know Centre for London all about working with our partners, so delighted that this has all come together. I'm very happy to launch the book tonight. It's the result of months of hard work for many of our contributors. It's the result of years of hard work. On a personal level, I was very pleased to work with Professor Travers and Richard Brown, who both of whom outranked me, one academically and one at Centre for London. Worth pointing out very briefly that Richard Brown and Pat Brown, who are both involved as authors in this book, are not related to me or one another. I'd be honoured to be related to them, but no nepotism, no Trump-like nepotism involved in the creation of this particular production. London's Mayor at 20, I hope, is an important document of record of an important innovation for both London and Londoners, the establishment of the Mayor of London, which is 20 years old this year. Like I say, we've made it in time for Christmas, so it still counts, 2020, delighted with that. The book's conclusions about the mayoralty itself are broadly positive, and hopefully will leave readers feeling broadly positive too, although there is plenty of room for improvement in terms of what the mayoralty has achieved, not the book. The book is absolutely perfect, of course. None of this would be possible. We always say this, and it's particularly true on this occasion. None of this would have been possible without the help of our sponsors, Argent LLP, Gensler, Gerald Eve LLP, Herbert Smith Freehills, Landsec, London Communications Agency, and Stanhope PLC. We are incredibly grateful to all of our sponsors and our academic partner, the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London. Full disclosure, who are also my employer for half of my time when I'm not with Centre for London. So I think I can say we're delighted to have King's as an academic partner, but on behalf of King's, I think King's is very happy to be involved in this project as well. So I said it was nothing if not collaborative, this book. Very, very, very pleased to launch it tonight. A shame not to be able to gather people together in person and give you all a glass of wine or a soft drink. Perhaps less of a shame not to give you a kind of bowl full of crisps, not really that appropriate in this day and age for everyone to be touching the same food. But this will I'm very happy that this is going ahead, regardless of the changed circumstances of remote working, learning, and communicating. Also, very quickly to thank the book's publishers, Bite Back, who have made this whole thing an absolute pleasure. And I'm realizing now that this is sounding a little bit like a kind of Oscars acceptance speech. Lots of people to thank because lots of people are involved in this, and I think that's one of the book's great strengths. We've got lots of different voices. We've tried. People have very strong opinions around the mayoralty. We've tried to get a range of different voices and produce something that's quite balanced, critical at times, but reflects different views. And I'm just really happy that it's out there. It is a real pleasure now to hand over to Professor Tony Travers, who's going to chair events this evening. Tony.
Okay, thank you, Jack. And the slight delay, I can admit, was, of course, because of slight technical gremlins here that we seem to have got over now. In the spirit of Greer Garson's very long Oscars acceptance speech in the 1940s, I too will say a few more words of thank you to all concerned, all the authors, Jack, Richard, all of them, everybody at the Centre for London our dear friends at King's College, and all others who've contributed to this remarkable book. It's a remarkable book about a remarkable period in London's history, 20 years ending in the remarkable way they have, but actually 20 years of extraordinary success in many ways. We'll never know what the counterfactual, if had there never been a mayor of London and a Greater London Authority, we'll never know what that would have been, but we do know what happened, and this book is an attempt to set that down once and for all. So I'll say no more than that. What I want to do really is to begin a panel session now, and I'm going to introduce my panelists first, and as I do that, I will then turn to each of them for about 10 minutes. Well, in total, 20 minutes, so slightly less than that each. And then we can open it out to Q&A, and feel free to pile in with your questions, thoughts, agreements and disagreements as we go along. Anyway, my panel. Baroness Jo Valentine, famous on the London scene over many years, ran London First, which itself had a starring role in the period up to 2000 that helped shape and create the debate into which the Greater London Authority, the Mayor and Assembly were born. Mehta, who is the Chief Executive of the Trust for London, a remarkable organisation that has for a very long time, under this and a previous name, been handing out resources to the dispossessed in London, giving grants to them. Nicky Gavron, long-time London Assembly member and London politician, the major role in the London Planning Advisory Committee before the GLA was created. And then, of course, you, our audience, who will be able to, as it were, join the panel through your questions or comments afterwards. So welcome all. And I'm going to begin with questions to Jo, or a question to Jo, really, which is, can you sort of outline the, as you see it, the way in which the business community, which obviously London First represented, came to have a view about the need for the citywide government for the mayor, and how it worked with it in its earliest days and tried to shape policy thereafter?
Okay, like a true politician, I'm going to half answer that question, okay, Tony, but do follow up with some further questions, okay, because I just thought I'd make some sort of opening remarks about the decade before we got a mayor and how the lead-in felt. And I think you're at London Communications Agency, so hello to Robert Gordon-Clark, with whom I shared the journey I'm about to talk about.
I'm sitting at his computer, actually.
Okay. So if I may, I was just going to go back to 91-2, which is the origins of London First itself. If you were alive even there, but if you think back then, we were emerging from recession, and London felt really down at heel, as like it was going nowhere. We just had the poll tax riots. Margaret Thatcher had just lost power, but some of her culture lived on. And from a business perspective at that time, at least we hadn't got that renegade Ken Livingstone and his GLC outfit hanging around. So that's how it felt back in the early 90s. London First was then created from a group of really visionary business people, and I still think they were visionary looking back on it now 30 years later, who liked the lack of bureaucracy, but felt that London needed more confidence in itself and better strategic direction. So they, having got together, alighted on a couple of themes. First was selling the brand of London, and the second was sorting out transport. It so happened that in 1991, London Planning and Advisory Council, with which Nicky was involved, had published a report on London, the World City. And London First latched onto this at a time when most people would have regarded London being a world city as laughable. But we created an inward investment agency for London. Again, Robert was very involved in that, but also championed the Millennium Pedestrian Bridge, the Globe Theatre, the London Eye, the Dome, a big period during the 90s of championing sort of projects that we felt, I mean, you could call them sort of trophy projects, but we felt they were about demonstrating the brand of London as a world city. We wrote an agenda on transport. We wrote an agenda for transport, an agenda for action on transport, I should say, and started pressing for investment in Crossrail. Alan Shepherd, who was chair during this whole period, understood that business on its own couldn't deliver, and needed to find a common cause with other sectors. So mid-90s, and again, one has to remember there was a much more of a sense of them and us between the unions and Thatcher, that the sort of legacy we were playing into. So the public sector talking to business was much less common then. Anyway, Alan pulled everyone together, including some bishops, as far as I remember, and into a London Pride partnership grouping, and they wrote the London Pride Prospectus. And the thing that surprised everyone who prepared that document was that there was agreement to about 95% of the issues in it. The one issue that they never found resolution on was runway 3 at Heathrow, and there's probably a lesson there. So I think business brings the ability the ability and the desire to cut through complex problems in a structured way. That's why most London First reports are agenda for action. And I think business also has a better feel for the marketplace and what genuinely will stimulate the economy than some of the other sectors. So by the end of the 90s, London First became persuaded that a mayor was necessary, essentially to get strategic London political decisions made. Alan Shepherd at the time was keen on an unfettered mayor, but appalled by the idea of Red Ken. So that's a be careful what you wish for lesson. However, he was pleasantly surprised once he got to know Ken. And I think in that first phase of the mayoralty, there was a real sense of unblocking strategic issues. We had road user charging, Crossrail, the Olympics, all of which I don't think would have happened without the figure of the mayor. And I just wanted to finish on what we lost by going to the GLA. I think what we lost was the sense of pioneering that group in the 90s had, pioneering the absence of a strategic government. Thanks.
Okay, very good. And having said that, something has got lost because, in a sense, the solution of the problem, or a problem, the creation of a new government for London, from a business perspective, as you look back now after 20 years, what would you say were the highlights of what, from the business community's point of view, what this institution has managed to do? I mean, if you were to choose one or two things, concrete things or conceptual?
Well, as I said, I mean, in a way, I think the first two mayoral terms were the best for business, but I don't know whether that's to do with Ken. I think it was just getting some stuff sorted out that had been hanging around for the previous decade. So as I said, Crossrail, I mean, putting the Olympic site together had some of the Ken flavour to it, and road user charging. I mean, I think that all those things were just really stepping in to try and start sorting out some of the strategic stuff. I think what you've seen with all the mayors is somebody standing up for London, which is great, and that is essentially overseas selling and politically defending London. I suppose where the role was least helpful, as we saw it, is over Brexit. Because certainly large swathes of London, I mean, clearly not all, but large swathes of the sort of world city business community wanted the links to Europe to reign as they were. And it was unfortunate that the mayor at the time was both leading on Brexit and Champion for London. I thought that was the greatest dissonance. But we had, I don't think Sadiq's done it, but certainly Ken and Boris have various sort of strings to their bows, which were alternative activity, including breeding children. Actually, I probably shouldn't say that, but they were those characters, which I think largely the business community liked. They were amazed to like Ken once they got to know him. Absolutely, that was a revelation to a lot of people.
I think it's fair to say that Livingston 2000 to 2008 was rather different to Ken Livingstone, leader of the GLC 1981 to 86. His policy towards business certainly had moved on a very long way. I mean, can I now turn to Bharat, bring you in here? You've had a long career looking at the way in which London's communities, inequalities in London have changed. And do you see the office of the Mayor of London as having effectively interacted with the third sector, with charities and NGOs, and having some consciousness of what often dispossessed and left behind communities need out of the city and its government?
Yes, an interesting point that Joe just made about, and you just made about the difference between the GLC and Livingston under GLC and Livingston under GLA. Was the GLC had a huge footprint with civil society organizations funding directly the organizations that have sort of operated at borough and even sub-borough level directly, bypassing local authorities, whereas the GLA had, in its new creation under Livingston, didn't have that grant-making power. Which is where independent outfits like ours fitted in. But to answer your question directly, I mean, it's been remarkable about how the mayor's office has interacted with civil society organizations, particularly in terms of addressing poverty and inequality. And I'll give three very quick examples, if I may. One was around the living wage campaign. It's emerged with Livingston, but he was never a particular champion for it, despite the fact that the unit that actually calculated the London living wage was based in the GLA. He never made much of it, never went out in a sort of strident way to champion it. That only happened, interestingly, post 2008 with Boris. And we made a significant grant to Citizens UK and commissioned research from Queen Mary University of London, which then brought on KPMG, Barclays, all the law firms, et cetera, to a point now where 50% of the FTSE 100 companies have signed up as accredited living wage employers, which means actually taking it down the supply chain, not just in their premises and their employees, but taking it down the supply chain. And that's made a remarkable difference to the amount of income that the lowest paid people in London actually get. So Boris was a particular champion, and I think that's continued with Sadiq Khan in an interesting way, championing the London living wage, but also taking on board the work and terms and conditions of lowest paid members of staff. So that's been interesting. The second one was about engaging with civil society organizations directly. As I said, with the GLC, there was a lot of engagement. With the GLA under Livingston, a little bit less so. With Boris, quite a lot of engagement with Citizens UK, but not as much as now with Sadiq Khan. He and his administration have been particularly good at engaging with civil society organizations. We're embarked on 2 pieces of work with the GLA, Moving On Up, which is about young black men getting into jobs. Now, young black men with the same level of degree, let's call it a 2-1 from a London university, are twice as likely to be unemployed as their peers from other communities. So we've targeted work with this group, and it's good to see the GLA championing the work through their WIN project, as they call it. And the second one is citizenship and integration. There are an awful lot of young people who are left out, whose status has been unclear for a long time, who might have arrived here, a bit like the Windrush generation, really, arrived here at the age of 2, etc., get to the point of 18, apply for university, don't qualify for a grant. So that's been good. And the third one, very quickly, is around, in disasters, there have been a number of successes, interestingly. I mean, Livingston was exemplary in, the post bombings that we had. Similarly, Boris rose to the many challenges. In fact, London Emergency Trust was, which the Trust for London was instrumental in setting up, was developed just at the cusp of the changeover that was taking place. And of course, Sadiq Khan has also played his part in galvanizing London's communities rather than playing into any kind of differences. So that's quite an achievement in a city as diverse as London, to ensure that people don't end up hating each other, fighting each other following incidents. That's been, I think, a credit to all 3 mayors.
Just to build on that final point before I move on to Nicky, so given that in this 20 years, London, which was already a very diverse city, diverse in a whole range of ways, has become substantially more so. We've now moved into an era of globally rather more difficult politics, what's popularly known as populism. Do you think that the role of the mayor in this regard, and you've hinted at this at the end, is going to have to continue more than in the past to act as a sort of an individual who can mediate between communities and kind of help, to put it rather simplistically, help them all get along?
Yes, I think it's a critically important role, and it's also it's about galvanizing the communities in London, or at least stopping fragmentation, if we're going to put a lower benchmark. But I think there's another strand that's actually creeping in, Tony, which I think is really important for the mayor to take on, which is the opprobrium that London now faces from almost every other city and every other part of the country. It's almost like London has become the sort of, something to whack at, because it's a metropolitan, it's elite, it's aloof, it's which I think sometimes are actually subtext for sort of diversity and all of those kinds of things. And I think there is an important role for the mayor to play in helping other cities, working with other cities to say, actually, there's a lot that we have in common, and the world is changing, and we can all work together to get communities to work together.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly the sense that, and there's some questions coming in Q&A about this, so we'll return to this, the sense that London's success has become a problem, and allied to that, the idea that somehow poor people in London are rich, which I must say would come as a bit of a surprise to many of us who look at the city, and that therefore London can, somehow needs resources taking away from it, is an intriguing place that we've ended up in after 20 years of success.
Can I just say one thing before we move on, which is this levelling up agenda is a very, very difficult one. If you look at all of the stats, almost all of the stats will tell you that London has higher levels of poverty and inequality than almost any other part in the UK, and that sort of seems to bypass people. And when you actually talk about it in percentages of London population, well, that's one way of looking at it. You look at it in numbers terms, it's phenomenally high, and it seems to just bypass the levelling up agenda. Is a difficult one. It's about which poor are we going to support, the ones up north or the ones down south in London. Yeah,
and I think, to be fair to John Allen, who's taken over the sort of post-COVID Recovery Commission, he does make this point increasingly, that there are lots of people in London who need levelling up, and indeed in other parts of the southeast. Anyway, I want to move on to Nicky now. So thanks, Bharat. Now, Nicky, you have been a London Assembly member since day one, and Deputy Mayor, indeed, under Ken Livingstone. So could you give a sense of the kind of priorities that you, as Deputy Mayor, pursued, and how you used the authority of the office, you know, to deliver some of the projects that you helped deliver, both on the environment and transport?
Hello, thank you very much for that introduction, Tony. And it's very good to be here. And I've just dipped into the book a little bit, and it's fascinating. Thank you for that achievement. I just want to say to those who are watching that I have an eye condition, which means I can't look at screens for very long. So I'm going to turn on my camera in a minute, and you're going to turn off my camera, sorry. Sure. And I'm afraid you're going to see a photograph of me.
That's fine, Nicky, don't worry, you do that, please.
Okay, I will do that. Okay, I'll do that right now.
Do it now.
So, yes, I'll do it now. To carry on, it's a bit of a rewind, this photo, but there you are. Just to say that I've been asked to cover, well, you've asked me to cover that, and that's something great, because I can do that. I would like to have covered the role of the Assembly, but maybe we can pick that up in the Q&A. And just want to say, so what was it like then, being Deputy Mayor? Well, to begin with, well, I was the first, that's the issue. I was the first, and I was the only one, and there was only one of me. And I think I worked a sort of, 24/7 day and 360-degree coverage. I had to liaise. One of the things, because it was different then from now, but I had an independent mayor, so I had to liaise and work closely with a not very Ken-friendly set of ministers, especially on congestion charging. And also, different from now, I was in at the beginning. Now, for me, the beginning was really the end of a rather long beginning, and I want to just explain that quickly. From the late 80s and through the 90s, I was very involved in shaping, with others, of course, the functions, form, style, and size of what I called an unequivocally strategic authority. And you and I talked about this quite a lot, didn't we, Tony, over those years? And as chair, I was in a privileged position, because as chair of, well, first leader of the Labour group, and then deputy chair, and then chair of LPAC. And I better just explain for those who don't know, LPAC was a statutory committee set up by the act that was going to abolish the GLA. It was an amendment in the Lords, and it gave it was representative of all the boroughs, leaders, and the city, and its job was to advise government ministers on strategic planning and policy for London. Now, we worked very closely, cross-sector, cross-partnership, and Joe has talked about this quite a lot. I mean, we worked, because of the initiative of London First, we all worked, we really did work together. And I spent a lot of time, actually, I became a director of London First, but I spent a lot of time actually working on transport projects, particularly congestion charging with London First. And then with many of the people in this, in the, I won't say in the room, but in the audience, I was able to pull together a whole lot. I directed a marvelous staff. And as I said, with many of the consultants, academics in the room, was able to pull together a whole solid framework of evidence and policy for the mayor to inherit. And then we actually did briefing with all the mayoral candidates. And not surprisingly, Ken was by far the most interested. Anyway, day one. So what I want to say is that day one for me was the culmination of years of work, hopes and dreams. But day one also, it's so hard to convey to you how challenging, how exciting that first term was. We began, squatting almost in Warney House with a tiny, really relatively compared with now, tiny group of officers, all gelling together from different organizations with a huge task. They actually had to address the backlog of underinvestment over those 14 years. And, inheriting a city of 7.3 million and going up, as we knew then, to 9 million. Now, Ken asked me, among other things, to advise him on strategic planning applications and to lead politically on the London plan, which was the plan of plans, which tied together the spatial framework of all the other strategies. Now, I said to him straight from the beginning, look, I can only really set sail on this if we have a vision of what we want for London. And, you know, Ken said, well, give me one. So, you know, I'd worked at one with my policy advisor before that, which was that London should strive to become an exemplary, sustainable world city, economically, socially, and environmentally. Now, Ken immediately agreed, because he agreed that was the London that we wanted. Now, the first thing I had to do was to get buy-in for that vision, and also for the framework addressing many of the big issues in London that LPAC had come up with. And I had to get buy-in from his inner circle of advisors, who I was getting to know pretty well by this time, and also had to get buy-in from his senior management team. And what we were addressing was those big questions: how should London grow? Where should it grow? Where and when should it grow? And very importantly, for whom should it grow? Now, that was, they took that on board, and it's to the credit of the GLA team that 9 months later, we actually had a document called Towards the London Plan, which we then were able to go out and consult on. And I remember I had a very flashy presentation, I don't know if you saw it, with all sorts of lights on it. So all the different transport schemes relating to town centres, regeneration areas, areas of opportunity, areas of deprivation were sort of there for them to see. And we got very constructive comments back, and a very, there's a wide consensus. Now, this was a bidding document. Well,
I mean,
Ken knew it was bidding.
Yeah, I mean, Nicky, just to stop you for a second, because I need to make sure we get plenty of time for Q&A. But I mean, I think you're absolutely right that the London Plan was a step forward in the sense of, unlike the rather cumbersome and long to produce plans that the GLC had evolved, it did have a view, and in a sense it's one that's been embodied subsequently, and the book does pick that up, as well as picking up the excitement of those early days. But just very just in a short answer, just sort of,
could I just
go on but only
just
briefly, because we need to get on to Q&A.
Very briefly, in the second term, I led all the work on, Ken gave me my head, and I led all the work on climate change and London's response to climate change. But what I learned in those, that if you want this is really crucial, a long-term infrastructure plan, visionary infrastructure plan needs, mayors aren't long-term. I also learned that, it's what they inherit and what they do with it that's so important. And I learned that mayors just don't do, they undo. And I watched, heartbreakingly, Boris, I know, I can praise him for some things, but I really watched him cancel, cut, and delay many of the myriad of initiatives that Ken had put in place. And I remember him saying very early on, after a couple of years, I have cut further and faster than any government department. And I really do think now, as Prime Minister, some of that pain is visiting London. And he dealt a pretty difficult hand to Sadiq. But Sadiq then had that hand compounded. What he inherited was, a sort of going backwards, because a lot was promised, but not much delivered. And then Sadiq had the terrorist attacks. Of course, it's 6 weeks after he came in, he had to deal with the referendum and Brexit. And then the tragedy of Grenfell. And I think, notwithstanding all that, he's achieved an enormous amount. And we can talk about that another time. But
okay.
I just want... Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicky. I need to move on, just because I'm sorry to cut across you, but there's a lot of questions coming in, and I just need to, if there's other points, you'll be able to sort of pick them up, I hope, answering some of the questions. So if you don't mind, can I, is that all right, Nicky?
Right.
Okay. Now I want to move on. So we've got Sam Mullins from the LT Museum, I assume. There may be others. Devolution has been effectively suspended. When the book finished, and if it had been this week, would any of its major conclusions have been different? Well, I think, in fairness, Sam, I can answer that myself. The book does include a sort of a section at the end about the way in which devolution has been undermined latterly. And related to that, a question from Nick Bose, if I can find Nick, from Inside City Hall, which was a related one. given, is the GLA mayoralty secure enough, or does it feel vulnerable given our lack of constitutional protections and always being at the whim of whoever has a working majority in Westminster? Now, Joe, you're a legislator these days. Do you see that, you know, Scotland and Wales are given deferential treatment by government, really, because they are constitutionally protected? But what about London? You know, and indeed other, Greater Manchester now, it doesn't seem that secure. Andy Burnham stepped out of line, you know, suddenly he's less favoured. None of this is very well rooted, is it? Or is it? Is it all secure? Joe?
Oh, Tony, I have no idea what the answer to that is, really. I can give you some reflections. I mean, I think London is both the capital city and it's you know, a city like any other. So I think we can't pretend we live in isolation in London, either actually of the rest of the country, but also of national government. I think the two have to be intertwined in London, and I think that does create difficulties for devolution. But there are aspects of devolution which are not relevant to that point. So I don't know how you deliver health locally. Probably is not affected by that assertion. I mean, I think it depends what you're looking for from a mayor and the GLA. I mean, London still has got its mouthpiece. You know, who's going to get hold of the money? I'm currently working for lots of places in the north. It's no easier to get hold of this new 4 billion quid that's come out for levelling up. You know, goodness knows, yet again on infrastructure projects that need to be done yesterday, with no sort of ongoing transformational change linked with it. I don't know.
Okay. Right. Well, that's well, a lot to be said for despair occasionally. So thank you for that. Can I take a question? I'm going to take a question from Caroline Pigeon now, Liberal Democrat member of the Assembly, who asks what further powers are needed for the Assembly. I assume you do literally mean the Assembly rather than the GLA as a whole, Caroline. And what has been its greatest success to date? So, Nicky, can I turn that to you? The Assembly. And there's another question about the Assembly, actually, if I can quickly find that, which I won't. Now, let's stay with that question first, and I'll come back to the Assembly. So, Nicky, what about, what's your views on powers needed, extra powers needed by the Assembly after your years on it?
I think first of all, I should say that I think the Assembly's done some very good and solid work. I mean, it has to scrutinise the mayor, and I think it's done that in, you know, very interesting ways. It's also made recommendations. Caroline herself, and together with, I think Val Shawcross backed her up on this, and we all backed her up, came in with the Hop Affair. It makes recommendations to the mayor, and it's also come in with some very, you know, some reports that are really, really good. I mean, it did that one on smoking in public places, etc. But I do think that the Assembly should, for instance, I mean, I think it should be able to not just have to vote 2/3 majority, which in fact the Assembly is hung, it'll never reach 2/3. I think it should be able to vote on different parts of the London plan.
You think it should vote on the London plan? You know,
Yes or no to the London.
So effectively a more legislative role, which of course in a fully American model, it would be a legislative body.
Sorry, you broke up for me then. I didn't hear
I think
that.
we all I said if this, you're effectively suggesting a slightly more legislative role for the Assembly, and that would make it more like an American model.
Yeah, well, not on many things, but particularly on the London plan, because although we could scrutinise it, we weren't able to make any amendments at and you know, it's not as though, you know, the idea that you either voted in or voted out just doesn't work. So that 2/3 majority. I also think the Assembly should be able to work with the scrutiny bodies. I mean, it's what Bharat was saying. We need more local involvement. We really need now to work more between the GLA and the local councils, I think. I mean, I think Sadiq's doing a lot of that, but it would help the scrutiny body of the GLA, if it could work with the scrutiny departments of different councils, work with the scrutineers, I think that would work too. And as I was saying, I think we should be able to, you know, really quiz the regulators as well, the Ofgems, the Ofsteds, so on. So that's for a kickoff anyway.
Okay, very good. Now, Isabel Dedring, former deputy mayor, has put in a question which is sort of building on one that Julian Ware put in. So I'm going to find Julian's question, which was, what about levelling up? Is it a threat? How should London influence the argument going forward? And Isabel has added to that one, just an observation, I think now's the time for London to fundamentally reposition itself vis-a-vis other UK cities, rather than the, quote, engine room generating X billion, used to be 30 plus, of tax for the rest of the country, which is a line we ran for 20 years, should be more of a peer relationship. How can key UK cities jointly pursue various agendas on a whole range of issues? So Bharat, is that something that makes, you know, it kind of chimes with the spirit of the age, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Isabel's hit it on the nail, so to speak. I think there's a lot of things that have not been good in London in terms of inequality. The amount of wealth, for instance, that's been flowing in. Now, that's been good for London, but actually it's been detrimental for Londoners, and particularly at the lower end. And work that we commissioned Transparency International to look into is to say, you know, how much money is actually flowing in, and it's billions, and how much of it is legit money or illegal. I mean, you know, Panorama did a program on that too. So London's become a sort of, you know, a cash laundry really, and we just need to be clear about that, because that feeds into the inequality. The second element is, you know, that could flow to other cities, undoubtedly. So there are lessons to be learned for that. And there are common strands that we can develop with them. Reforming council tax is another one. And your own work, Tony, that you led on, and London Finance Commission. I think, you know, the devolution that we actually require is around fiscal devolution. You know, I doubt if we'll ever get on par with Scotland, but, you know, it would be good to go halfway there. We're nowhere near that at the moment, but it's the sort of thing that other cities may well actually have some sympathy with in due course, because if devolution was enabled to London, but just as with Scotland, that would be a way of people having local control, and how that's exercised is by engaging local communities, people, etc.
Okay, very good. Now I'm going to sort of build on a question from, oh, Nicky, of course, do. I'm so sorry. I'm trying to get through as many questions as possible. Nicky, come on, do speak, please.
Very quickly, because I think the mayor at 20 is now joined, you know, at the end of his London plan. Sadiq has a section saying, I can't deliver this without more funding and fiscal freedoms. And you know, the mayor at 20 is now joined by 8 other mayors. There's another mayor, Metro mayors, another mayor coming, and they're all working together. They're really working collaboratively. And I think they realize, and they know that they'll never deliver this recovery unless there's, you know, much less centralization and much greater devolution. And I think these other points have been well made by Bharat.
Yeah, I think, and seeing London as the first of a number, and then the possibility of the whole of England getting some form of devolution via a bit of a reorganization is, I think, now on the agenda more than for some time. Now, Simon Dishman had a question I'm going to build out from a bit, which is, he says, is the current intention to publish a version of the London plan? Sorry, I'm misreading it here. The point is, the London plan exists. Is it fit for purpose, especially as we move into the world after COVID-19? And what are the likely implications that are going to be that COVID will have on city planning looking forward? Now, I think this is it is slightly looking forward from the end of this book, but it's an intriguing place we've arrived at, because, you know, the London plan was written for a different world.
you
So
asking
Nicky,
me?
yes, Nicky, you're
Yes.
you know the
I'm a London plan person.
expert.
Yes, okay. I do think, first of all, I want to say the government has been sitting on the London plan for 1 year, okay? It was the intent to publish went in last December. And I think, I don't know what's going on, because it's creating, along with all the other uncertainty that's been created by the changes in the current planning system, the future of the white paper planning, I mean, along with all those, there's so much uncertainty, and it's really not good for London. It's delaying, it has an impact on London and Londoners, number one. Secondly, the way planning works is, this plan should definitely be published, and then what will happen is there'll be alterations, and they'll go through quite quickly. So you alter it depending on it. But I think a lot of what's in the plan is going to work in terms of where we are now. So, I mean, I could.
Okay, that's very helpful.
More,
No,
but I mean, I don't know if you.
Joe, what do you think? I mean, if you were still at London First, or even you now, do you think that there's going to have to be a complete rethink of the model? I mean, you know, the economy is going to change more in the next year in one step, or next 2 years, 3 years, than for a very long time.
Yeah, I know. I was mulling on it while you were talking. I mean, the things on my mind are Black Lives Matter, which in a way is again just talking about failure to reach out to certain communities and certain communities being disempowered. You've then got community activism, which obviously has been, you know, we've seen a lot of during positive community activity, neighbours during COVID, and then you've got digital revolution, and of course we've seen that accelerated. I was speaking to somebody at UCL earlier who said they'd done in 6 months what they should have done in 10 years. 5 years was catching up, and the 5 years was the next 5 years. So I'm just struck by something Howard Davis said when we were looking at the economy of London, I don't know, about 10 years ago. And he said people think of the economic growth as a sort of static thing where you have a business and the business employs people and therefore your GBA or GDP. Actually, he said, the way to think about it is if you've got talented people and you give them the tools, they will create the economy. And so I think London and elsewhere, the digital revolution, we just need to empower people to do what they will do if we give them the tools to do it. And that's both skills and literally, the ecosystems that will enable businesses to evolve. London's a funny old beast. It feels like, we were going at 100 miles an hour. We're now by mistake gone pretty slowly. But actually this need to join up the bit that's going at 100 miles an hour with the people who aren't going at 100 miles per hour is much more important post-COVID. And it sort of feels like if you were waiting the reach out to deprived communities versus the foot on the growth pedal, it feels to me like the balance ought now to be a little bit more soft pedal on the accelerator and more reaching out. But we're more exposed now than we've ever been. So on the other hand, we need to be really making sure we've got a robust economy. We've got economic resilience. So I don't know the answer for London. I haven't been thinking about it recently, but I think the zeitgeist has changed so dramatically with Brexit and COVID for London. Some of me just thinks we'll just flip straight back to how we were once we get through COVID, and you won't actually notice much difference. So I don't know. I really don't know. It certainly requires thinking about, Tony.
Okay, very good. Now, there's a question from Michelle Dix, which is not dissimilar to one from Andrew Campling and somebody who calls themselves anonymous attendee. So Michelle's question, there have been a number of thoughts earlier in the mayoralty to combine the boroughs to create fewer, larger sub-regional authorities alongside the GLA. And Andrew's point was along the same lines as indeed is, in fact, anonymous attendee says, are the boroughs' days numbers, often too inward looking and then fail to work across boundaries? So, Nicky, you've been a borough councillor in Haringey as well as an assembly member. And Ken, I think Ken Livingstone at one point was when you were his deputy, wanted to go for pizza slices, 5 pizza slices. Anyway, what do you have a thought on this? Too many boroughs?
He wanted 5 super boroughs.
Yeah.
I must say, when I was a councillor and I went to Birmingham and I saw what Birmingham could do with, 1 million people, that's 4 boroughs. I did think, well, maybe we don't have the clout as one borough. But I do think what's happening now is that the boroughs are joining up in all sorts of ways, and they're also sharing services. And I think the way forward might be much more joint working and sharing of services. There is a case to be made. Well, I'm not sure about this, because I think I think I'd stay with joint services and working closely together. I do think it's very important, though, this joint working across borough boundaries. It's absolutely crucial. And the government's got to come up with something better than this vapid duty to cooperate.
Okay. Bharat, you work with charities throughout and groups throughout the 32 boroughs and the city. Do you think there are too many of them?
Well, it's interesting. I'll answer the question in a slightly different way. If it's going to be Brussels to Whitehall to City Hall and Town Hall, and it stops at that, then we've got a bit of a problem looming. I think it's got to go below to communities. So whether we have a pizza slice approach in terms of fewer boroughs, but more sub-regional authority, or fewer sub-regional authorities, or more, or stick to the 32 plus the city. I think the underlying principle has to be that it actually gets down to community level or just above that to make decisions about having some control, some say, some engagement. I think the problem is quite often that it actually doesn't, the structures are one thing. They're administrative structures which don't necessarily allow for people to be as engaged as they would like to be or could be. And I think we may be looking at it from the wrong side of the lens, really.
So I switched myself off. Okay, I'm going to take a question from Germany. We haven't had any questions from, well, actually, it's from a German social scientist, Matthias Kuhlmann. So as a German social scientist, might not be in Germany, and it might be anywhere in the world these days, but anyway, as a social scientist, German social scientist, being involved in European exchange programs on urban development since 1994, in times of growing political skepticism towards national governments worldwide, mayors, governments and parliaments of cities are more important than ever in order to strengthen trust in democracy, economy, and social coherence again. Do you agree? It's a nice question, and I think it has a theme that everybody's going to agree with. But Joe, what do you think?
Yes, I agree. I just wanted to come back on what Bharat was saying. On this sort of tiering of government structures. I think certain issues have natural boundaries. So I always think the very community-centric social challenges are very local and should be dealt with at a very local level, roughly a ward level. And so the sort of parish council sort of grouping to go to do the deep dive and really tackle some really difficult questions. And then I do think the sub-regional structure is roughly the right thought, although goodness help anyone who actually tries to define the boundaries of the sub-regions. I think that one even fought Ken off. So, as a pragmatic way of solving that, I would go with what Nicky was suggesting. I think making the money go so that it sort of forces collaboration is part of that. But anyway, yes, I think you've had, as you've said, very populist governments in various places. I think people do possibly feel more removed from those governments in terms of taking their issues seriously. So yes, I agree is the short answer.
Well, good. Do you agree, Bharat? You get more trust, people at city level and below city level.
Absolutely, it's critical that the mayor is like a lightning rod really of community engagement. It's been phenomenal to see the current mayor Sadiq Khan sort of engaging so much with communities in a number of different ways, particularly around the recovery. London Recovery Programme has got a significant engagement from community organisations of how London will recover from COVID-19. And it's, arts and culture haven't been mentioned. We haven't talked a lot about universities and colleges, etc. But, these are institutions that make it good to live in London. And I think we need to think about what is it that will make people stay in London before London loses its sparkle. What is it that makes people want to stay in London, bring up their children in London and work and live and enjoy? So it's arts and culture, it's community engagement, good efficient transport, colleges, digital infrastructure, all of those kinds of things. I won't rattle the whole list, but it's, and a mayor can bring that together at a regional level.
Okay, that's good.
Okay, Nicky, do you want to
I
very briefly, we're nearly running out of time.
I would add to what Bharat said in terms of affordable housing, because I think it's a huge issue for London. Now, I absolutely agree, we've got to disperse power more widely. We should engage. I think it's great what Sadiq's doing with local communities. We need more of it. Now, in terms of cities, just take climate change. Last week was Climate Change Action Week, London Climate Change Action Week. London actually is positioned in terms of cities all over the world and climate change is absolutely pivotal. What London does in terms of collaboration with other cities, it's soft power, whether it's on culture or climate change, is really, really important. And it matters, cities matter, because that's when it comes to action on the ground, they're center stage, and particularly on climate change, because they've got the responsibility. We're also vulnerable, we've got our citizens, but we've got huge economic opportunities. And, if we work together, we'll actually, I think, be able to deliver in a good way for our citizens. And it is, I think, climate change is the greatest economic opportunity. And that the city network is absolutely crucial for that. But it's collaboration. It's not working in isolation, whatever sphere of government you're at.
Okay, well, the producer of this program said I could overrun by 5 minutes, and I've now overrun by 4 at least, and I'm going to have to hand back to Jack in a minute. So I'm sorry to various people on the call I know, like Will Jennings, Siobhan Benita, Victoria King, not getting to them, but I do want to read out another question or an observation which I don't have really time to have answered, but it's one for everybody to take away and think about as they, in addition to remembering to go out and buy this excellent book. But Isabel asks, what do we think London will look like in 20 years' time, reflecting on the topics explored in the book and in this discussion? And I think that's an interesting way for all of us to sort of take away from, this is at 20. The next 20 years, a lot of change will happen. Probably slightly more awkward to think our way through that even than the last 20 years would have been in 2000. But there isn't enough time to do that. So what I need to do instead is to thank Joe Valentine, Baroness Valentine, Bharat Mehta, and Nicky Gavron for so enthusiastically joining in with our questions and answers this afternoon. Thank the Centre for London and all its fabulous people behind the scenes, too many to mention, as they say, but wonderful, Caroline, all the rest, everybody there, thank you very much. And now I'm going to hand back to Jack at the Centre for London. Thank
you so much, Tony. I'm not at the Centre for London. Centre for London's offices are more
metaphorically at the Centre for London.
I'm as much at Centre for London as anyone is ever anywhere these days. I should just explain very quickly, there's a question in the chat there saying, big thank you to Centre for London and Tony and the panel. It says it's from Tony Travers, but I believe it's not from you, Tony Travers. I believe it's from the very naughty boys who have just appeared on the camera as well, who I believe are in London Communications Agency headquarters. I would like to echo Tony's thanks. Thank you also, Tony, for wonderfully chairing our event. Thank you so much to the panel. Thank you to our very interesting and esteemed audience. We got some really great questions through, so we didn't manage to get through to all of them, but we started late and we end late. That's a good thing, is it? I don't know. That's what we did. That's what we should do. I also would like to thank the sponsors once more: Argent LLP, Gensler, Gerald Eve LLP, Herbert Smith Freehills, Landsec, London Communications Agency, Stanhope PLC, and the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London, who are the academic partner for this project. I've saved the very best to last. You can also buy the book from Centre for London if you go onto our website. I believe we should be popping a link into the chat. I recommend the book. Please do buy it. You can also join our mailing list, to which we should also be putting a link in the chat. And with, again, it sounded like the Oscars again a little bit, but I think that is all. Thank you all so much for being with us. I very much hope that we can all get together in person. We've got a vaccine now. Everything's going to be absolutely fine. Look forward to seeing you all in person, I hope, in 2021. Thank you so much.